Okay, so let's start. Welcome to our webinar on cutting crime impact, innovating security solutions with human-centered design. I'm very glad to see some familiar names and some new names in the list of attendees. My name is Margot Molkenbuhr. I work at DPTE, an Institute for Applied Prevention Research at the German Prevention Congress, and I'm very happy to be your host today. As speakers today, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Caroline Davey and Andrew Wootton. They are directors of the Design Against Crime Solution Center at the University of Salford and are, by the way, doing a very great job in leading the EU-funded CCI project. And I'm very happy and pleased that Dr. Dagmar Heinrich is supporting us today. She's a research fellow in the project and will moderate the discussion and your questions later on. Today's webinar is the kickoff of a webinar series on the project Cutting Crime Impact, which focuses on the prevention of high impact petty crime. In this project, 12 partners from 7 countries are involved and have developed very concrete and very practical tools for law enforcement agents and police forces to support them in different areas of police crime prevention. And special fact about this project is its methodology, because it's very human-centered, it's very focused on the end user's needs, it's very bottom-up instead of top-down, and it's very innovative. And that's exactly what our speakers are talking about today. Before we start, I would like to give some technical advice. First, the webinar will be recorded so that colleagues who did not have time to attend today have the opportunity to watch it afterwards. And secondly, of course, you have the opportunity today to ask questions and to make comments. And to do this, you have a small mark in a speech bubble. And then a window will open and you can write your questions. Feel free to use this already during the presentation because our moderator will read them and then discuss them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I would like to give the floor directly to Caroline and Andrew and wish you all a very interesting webinar and hopefully a lively discussion in the end.
Thank you very much, Margot. So my name is Caroline Davey and I'm a Professor of Design, Innovation and Society. I'm here this morning with Andrew Wootton and we're going to be offering a human-centered perspective on security research and police practice. We've called our presentation Cutting Crime Impact, Innovating Security Solutions with Human-Centered Design. For those of you who don't know us, Andrew and I run the Design Against Crime Solution Centre at the University of Salford, which we established in 2005. And the Solution Centre is a partnership with Greater Manchester Police and the Landeskriminalamt in Lower Saxony, Germany, and with the Research and Urban Planning Consultancy, DSP Group, in the Netherlands. Through such partnerships, we gain insight into the real-world issues that are facing practitioners and can work with them in collaborative research projects. Our approach has evolved over 20 years' experience leading national and international research projects in which we've used design research to understand and innovate around complex issues, including those listed here. In essence, our research uses the design process as an organizing framework, a structure, if you like, for delivering human-centered, transdisciplinary research. We've divided our presentation today into a number of parts. And what we'd like to do is to begin by talking about the European Security Research Programme, because that is through the funding of the various research projects that is shaping the security discourse. The European Security Research Programme was set up by industry, the military, key researchers and the European Commission. Its focus at the beginning was very much on technology and on the military, and very much less on human aspects and societal aspects, including ethical issues. The programme tends to focus on supporting research to address international security issues, such as terrorism, organised crime, natural and man-made disasters, and more recently, cybercrime. Within the programme, technology is considered vital for security. Indeed, what they say is that without technology, security is impossible. But when we look at the definition of what is a technology, then we can look to the original Greek definition, and we can find that it's actually quite broad. So it can actually encompass a whole range of things, from techniques to skills to methods, processes, services or goods. So it doesn't have to be narrowly defined. What we see in the European Security Research Programme, that the focus is very much on the software and on the hardware, basically on the things that seem to go beep, is very much the focus for that type of research. Now, we know that there's been some critique of the approach. There's a number of interesting articles and documents that have been written by Statewatch, and they highlight some of the problems with this particular approach. What they say in particular is that European security research is supporting the creation of a surveillance society, and that it's also not actually considering ethical issues, or when they do, that these are narrowly defined. There have been positive developments more recently, particularly with Horizon 2020, and what we've seen is the inclusion of non-technology projects, particularly in the fields of radicalisation and also areas like restorative justice. We've also seen a few new topics come in, such as, for instance, domestic violence, and very much over the past few years, then prevention has certainly been a key issue within the programme. However, I have to say that the traditional EU security discourse still dominates. What we've seen, for instance, is that when we have an issue such as crime, it's often referred to as petty crime. The focus is very much on the harder side of those crime issues, such as on robbery and violence, less on the softer issues related, for instance, to feelings of insecurity or antisocial behaviour. What we also see is that the calls can be very prescriptive and also quite conservative. So we think there's a need for a different approach. Sorry, Andrew, you go.
Sorry, so there is an alternative vision for European security research, which looks at innovative and appropriate use of technology. So we think that currently there's a number of very technology-led schemes that tend to promote technology that doesn't actually suit the user or, in some cases, the context. And in fact, we believe strongly that technology shouldn't be driving the security research process, and there's a number of reasons for this, one of which is there's something called the technology spiral, which was identified some years ago, and this is where you have a technological opportunity and there is some sort of performance or productivity requirement, and they are brought together, and the designers will then infuse technology. In some way, technology is seen as a panacea. And the result is that the users become overwhelmed by complexity and alternatives, the maintainers become overwhelmed by complexity, and managers are overwhelmed by data. And these issues are then thought to be solved by that designers reacting and introducing technology fixes, effectively infusing more technology into the system. And then that results in increased complexity for users, increased maintenance complexity, and increased management complexity. And overall, you end up with a performance shortfall, specifically relating to the early inflated expectations of what would be achieved. By this stage, of course, what generally happens is that a new technological opportunity has come along, and the cycle begins again. Hence, it's a spiral. And this was identified, as you can see, back in 1985, but yet it's still something that we see in some of these large technological initiatives, in that the focus is being driven by technological opportunity as opposed to end user need and understanding of that. So we feel that a human-centered and appropriately designed technology can, of course, create and support security. And that there do exist very human-centered and innovative uses of technology. A nice example of this is a system called Callisto, which is used for the reporting of sexual misconduct by university students in the United States. And it's a system that's been very sensitively developed for what is quite harrowing time, potentially. And it fits in with the way that the end users operate at that period in an incident, and enables the recording of a potential incident is sort of held in escrow, if you like, until that point in time when the potential victim feels that they actually want to formally report it. But the whole system has been set up around the needs and the quite sensitive issues around issues of sexual assault.
So our project adopts a different approach. It's called Cutting Crime Impact, and it's about practice-based innovation in preventing, investigating, and mitigating high-impact petty crime. Petty crime is a term used by the EU to differentiate everyday crimes from organised crimes, which is their more traditional priority. We've used the term in our strapline, but we actually rarely use it outside of the EU. The reason for this is because in English, petty actually means small or insignificant. And obviously that's not appropriate to describe the type of crimes that impact on citizens' everyday lives. Cutting Crime Impact involves a consortium of partners. There are 12 of us. And at its heart, there are 6 law enforcement agencies: the National Police of the Netherlands, Greater Manchester Police in the UK, the Estonian Police and Border Guard, the Municipal Police of Lisbon, the State Criminal Police of Lower Saxony in Germany, and the Department of the Interior in Catalonia. The consortium is supported by research organisations, the University of Salford, DSP Group, and the University of Groningen. The last of which is responsible for looking at the ethical, legal and social issues that are related to our focus areas. And we also have 2 networking organisations. That's our host today, the Deutsche Präventionstag, and also the European Forum for Urban Security. And we also work together with a communication design agency, which is called LOBA. So in terms of our objectives, our main ones are to enable law enforcement agencies and security policymakers to adopt a preventative, evidence-based and sustainable approach to tackling high-impact petty crime, to also support 6 law enforcement agencies in researching and innovating practical evidence-based tools that meet end-user needs and operational contexts. We have 4 focus areas: predictive policing, community policing, crime prevention through urban design and planning, measuring and mitigating citizens' feelings of insecurity. And each of those focus areas are addressed by 2 law enforcement agencies. Most importantly, what I would like to say is that these focus areas were not actually specified by the EU, nor were they chosen by us as the coordinator. that they were actually areas selected by the LEAs themselves. And I think our project is quite unusual in actually addressing 4 different areas within a single project. But the area that we'd like to talk about more today is community policing. So moving on to then part 2, community policing, which is at the core of policing by consent. We'd like to talk a little bit about the theory or the background to community policing. Community policing is a philosophy that promotes organisational strategies that support partnership working and problem solving. And it's to address issues such as crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. In other contexts, it's quite often comes by the name of, for instance, neighbourhood policing or proximity policing. Community policing is delivered by community police officers patrolling a territory or neighbourhood, and importantly, they work in partnership with key stakeholders.
So in the UK, the background to community policing, or as it's known here, neighbourhood policing, dates back to the mid-19th century, where Sir Robert Peel brought together the then disparate group of parish constables and watchmen who were patrolling the streets of London and created a new police force. And this force was constructed to prevent crime by patrolling and checking security of buildings and apprehending suspicious persons. But it adopted a beat structure with each constable responsible for a small patch. And this jigsaw structure has provided the basic framework for British policing pretty much ever since. I just want to talk a bit about the Peelian principles. So these were 9 principles that were set out at the same time as general instructions that were issued to every new police officer from 1829 onwards. They weren't actually written by Robert Peel, they're probably more likely written by the first commissioners of the police. But they're very interesting in that now they sound incredibly modern to our ear. So these are the 9 principles. I won't go through them in detail, but some of the highlights are, for example, the first one is that the principle is to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression. So it's very much a focus on crime prevention as the first principle of policing. Another one is to recognise always that the power of the police is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions, and behaviour. So again, this is about public consent to be policed. Another one is to use physical force only when the exercise of persuasion, advice, and warning is found to be insufficient. So it's about officers having interpersonal skills, being able to deal with people, and not about resorting to just force. To maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and that the public are the police. So this was a civilian police force, and the only difference was that the police were paid and were wearing a uniform, but it was about that relationship with the public. And finally, to recognise always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder and not the visible evidence of police action. So again, a focus on preventing crime in the first place rather than high-profile repressive police action. So this style of policing that the beat model encouraged has become something that's uniquely British and uniquely consensual, and it's been recognised as this from the 1930s onwards. So it's very locally focused, it's preventative, and it's delivered by consistent, familiar, uniformed civilians. And when we say policing by consent, this refers to the idea of consent of the governed. Which is the government's legitimacy and moral right to use power is only justified when they have the consent of those over whom they exert power. And this relates to Article 21 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. So, of course, in practice, Europe contains multiple political histories that all have impacted on the development of policing. We have some countries, for example, Spain, where there was democratization only after the death of the dictator in 1975. In Portugal, similarly, dictatorship came to the end in 1970. In some areas of Eastern Europe, of course, the relationship with policing was very strained. And policing has been impacted by European conflicts, for example, the impact of World War II on perceptions of police activity. And all of these have affected the emergence of this community approach to policing. So the UK has been a relatively stable liberal democracy since 1689, the Bill of Rights. It was reformed, as we referred to earlier, by Robert Peel in the mid-19th century. We have a long history of community or neighbourhood policing, and citizens expect to see police officers patrolling on the street on foot. It's a civilian force, so they're not armed. And the most recent change to community policing has been the introduction of police community support officers in 2002 in the UK, and they were focused on reducing crime and antisocial behaviour. And they have limited police powers. They have no power of arrest. They can't formally interview or process prisoners. They can't investigate crime, and they wear a slightly different uniform. Notably, they don't wear the traditional policeman's helmet that we have in the UK. So in practice, community policing is delivered by officers who are either on foot or on bike, or increasingly, unfortunately, in vehicles. They engage with local citizens and local businesses, and they work in partnership with key local stakeholders, the municipality, to address problems in the community relating to a whole range of issues that could be to do with vulnerability and issues like that. And this can be compared with responsive policing, where we have police response officers who actually have to respond to incidents or emergencies, are focused on dealing with crime incidents and catching criminals. They patrol. If they do patrol, it's often in vehicles. And it's difficult for them to commit to meetings with stakeholders because they often have to leave and respond to incidents. So it's a different type of approach.
So while community policing is expected by citizens in the UK, it's been increasingly difficult to deliver because of the budget cuts that we've had since 2010. That's reduced police officer numbers, and it's also led to police forces then having to focus their resources on crime incidents. It's meant that there's not been such a focus on strategic approaches like community policing. What we've really seen is that police beat areas have been enlarged because there have been fewer officers to patrol, and they're also more likely to patrol bigger areas, probably in vehicles, so that they can actually respond to incidents as well. PCSOs are also being diverted from their neighbourhood patrolling to support other police functions. And we know of at least one police force that they've actually eliminated the PCSO role altogether. But when it comes to improving community policing, then what we believe is that community policing is necessarily human-centered. Improvement requires actually supporting meaningful community engagement activities. So it means investing in officers on the beat, patrolling communities, value and actually sustaining the relationships that they have with the community and with other key stakeholders. And what you also need to be aware of is the potential for community policing to be undermined by technology solutions. And what we don't want is that in the effort to try and make policing better, that we inadvertently kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And what we might mean by that is that we believe that community policing offers the golden egg in the sense that it is providing access to criminal intelligence. Sometimes that's related to counter-terrorist intelligence. There's also, through their engagement with young people and with schools, the opportunity to reduce delinquency. and probably most importantly, through their engagement with, for example, hard to reach communities, then it's through community policing that we're actually increasing trust in policing. So how should we then develop tools to support community policing?
Okay, so that moves us on to part 3 of the presentation, which is about the CCI approach to developing these policing tools. So what we do in CCI is we take a design approach. That means we take a very broad definition of design. So we don't mean design as in styling or fashion or just how things look, but as Steve Jobs would say, it's about how it works. So not just what it looks like or how it feels like, but how something works is a part of design. So that means we're looking at things like product design, service design, design of environments, of communications, of systems and of processes, ways of doing things. And we're using design approaches and theories around things like user-centered design, systems design, design thinking, and human-centered design. So CCI focuses on innovation and what we call end user centeredness. So we're interested in understanding the end user to get insight. And it also focuses on problem framing. So turning or revisiting problems to frame them in different ways in order to be able to optimize adoption of solutions. What we don't want to have is, at the end of the project, just what's sometimes called shelfware, things that just sit on shelves. We're looking for the outputs of the project to be actually adopted. And when we talk about innovation, we talk about innovation in the context of the design discipline, the concept of product, service, process design. And innovation is looked at somewhat differently in traditional engineering new product development, in that the traditional approach was to start with a product, to analyze the product, and to then from that develop a new version of the product that might be cheaper, might be made slightly different, might have an additional feature or so. So the approach in design innovation is to actually abstract from a product. And so by abstracting from the initial product, you then provide opportunities to reconfigure and create a new approach. So for example, abstracting from an MP3 player, you then think about enjoyment of music. You look at it at a more abstract level and think about different ways in people could enjoy music. And this is what Apple did when they developed the iPods and then moved on to that to iTunes and the whole ecosystem around music that is now changed the way people enjoy and listen to music. So from these options that are generated, you can then dig back down to reality, as it were, and develop a new product solution or a new design solution that is completely disconnected from the starting point.
So
And in order to in order to do this, we undertook design research with our partner at LEAs. Actually worked with them for them to undertake design research of their particular focus areas, and we then using that research outcome brought us all together as a sort of community of practice to address the different issues and to try and develop solutions. And this draws very much on human-centered design theory and practice. So human-centered design places the human being at the center of the design process. It focuses on the humans in any design system. And it was developed in systems design area in response to problems caused by designs that were overly focused on technology. So human-centered design avoids the technology spiral that we covered earlier by concentrating on the people throughout a system or a product design. So it looks at the nature of their roles and their needs. How can their roles be supported? How can their needs be met? And human-centered objectives rather than technology drive the design process. And those objectives are to enhance human abilities, so these need to be identified, understood, and cultivated, to overcome human limitations, so to identify these and then devise compensatory mechanisms. A good example of a human limitation is we are very error tolerant. Human beings are very error tolerant. So one of the very early computing compensatory mechanisms that was developed was the undo command, which, if you're like me, I'd probably use it hundreds of times a day. But that's a sort of a limitation of humans compared with machines. We are error tolerant, therefore we have to design a mechanism to deal with that. And the third objective is to foster human acceptance, to understand and address preferences, concerns, and values. So human-centered design is bottom up rather than top down. So it requires looking at ground level at what's going on rather than the boardroom view of what the problem is. It supports problem definition and, importantly, reframing of problems. As Russell Ackoff says, we fail more often because we solve the wrong problem than because we get the wrong solution to the right problem. It focuses on human capabilities, agency, and responsibility, and offers an alternative perspective. So, for example, what is the purpose of predictive policing? So from a traditional predictive policing point of view, and this is a quote from Meyer and Wessels, the purpose of predictive policing is the collection and analysis of data for identification and prediction of individuals or areas with an increased probability of criminal activity to help developing policing intervention and prevention strategies and tactics. But from a human-centered design perspective, at its basic level, the purpose of a designed predictive policing system should be to support the human police officers who are responsible for preventing and fighting crime. So such a design system can't be wholly technology-centered, because technology, it has to be an enabler of human-centered objectives rather than some sort of magical panacea. So clearly the human-centered approach requires a deeper understanding of users and their contexts, and therefore to adopt a human-centered mindset, you have to adopt an attitude that's curious, empathetic, imaginative, collaborative, iterative, and humble. This is not easy, but there are tools to enable these different perspectives. So what we did in CCI was we used, as Caroline said earlier, the design process as a framework for the project process. So the design process begins with a problem or an opportunity, and then it follows a number of stages of divergent and convergent thinking as you move from your problem or opportunity through the design brief to the designed outcome. And these stages are discover, define, develop, deliver, deploy, and digest. And once deployed and digested, a solution may over time become a source for other opportunities, and so the cycle may begin again. So in CCI, our project activities are mainly being within these first 4 stages. So in the discover phase, we undertook 2 work packages, or the LEAs undertook 2 work packages to research and understand requirements and the problem context in each of the 4 focus areas.
And in terms of the research that they actually conducted, the LEAs interviewed experts and practitioners, and in relation to each focus area, they also produced a review of the state of the art. And they conducted research into current end user practice, and they brought that all together to review the findings and to identify emerging themes. Other CCI partners also conducted research into the ethical, legal, and social issues related to the focus areas. But most important in terms of actually gaining the insight that we would need to be able to develop the tools was actually this research that was developed, that was undertaken into end user practice by the LEAs themselves. And what they were looking at was that they were observing the police officers understanding the nature of their roles, their needs, their preferences, their concerns, and their values.
So using the results from this research, we then went into the define phase, where we ran a number of collaborative design lab workshop activities to analyze findings, generate insights, and define solutions. And this early phase, the discover and the define stages, is sometimes referred to as the naturalist phase in human-centered design, because this is where you're acting like Diane Fossey as a naturalist, going in and trying to really look at what's going on the ground. So this is not about people telling you what they want you to hear about what they're doing. This is a lot of the time, this is about observing what's actually happening at the front line, as it were. And so then in the developed stage, we had a couple of work packages that were looking at designing, prototyping and developing, specification for the tools. The deliver phase, we then went on to finalize, produce and demonstrate the tools. And now we have some CCI tools that are the design outcome. And over the next 6 months, there will be tool implementation and deployment taking place in each of the force areas, and hopefully supporting it moving beyond that as well. So the importance of that front-end research can't be overestimated. The research needs to be used not just to simply post-rationalize ideas that were held, that people brought to the project, but actually enabled us to frame the focus areas better, to identify perspectives and problems of interest, to identify users and stakeholders that we needed to involve, and importantly, to generate insight that led to new thinking and novel ideas around these different themes. And so what we tell our partners is that at this first stage, it's important to let go of the edge of the pool and put your initial ideas, park them to one side, and undertake a deep dive to actually explore what's going on. And it's amazing what you find that's of value that is brought back from that. That provides the source of insight that is used then through analysis and mapping. We were looking at what the different findings were, and that was all then fuel for the design labs, where we worked together to develop different solution directions.
So we'd like to share with you in part 4 some of the lessons from the front line. As a result of the research that was done by our LEAs, and we got a real understanding into the context and to the values and the attitudes of the end users. We were also able to reflect on some of those findings, and one of the things that we felt was that many of the tools and solutions that are adopted to try and improve policing actually have a very narrow concept of what policing is. We were struck by the fact that there are many different aspects to the policing role, from community policing, crime prevention, to responding to incidents, to crime reduction. And in failing to understand that, what we felt that was happening, for instance, in relation to predictive policing, is it was as though officers are actually being treated as chess pieces on a chessboard, and that they can be deployed efficiently, so moved around by somebody else. And we suggested that this might actually stem from a military way of thinking about policing. And the problem is that it certainly does not reflect how policing actually works. Not only that, it's actually fundamentally demotivating for the police officers themselves.
And this is where some of the work that we've done overlaps with an area of humanist psychology called self-determination theory, which is about looking at motivation and productivity of individuals. And this suggests that human well-being requires satisfaction of 3 psychological needs: autonomy, the need to be able to control your own actions and act in harmony with what you think is the right thing to do; competence, the ability to seek control and want to be master or to experience mastery or expertise in an area; and relatedness, in terms of the need to be to feel connected to and experience caring for others. And the theory suggests that when you meet these needs, then you create intrinsic motivation within the individual. And this is incredibly powerful in that it means that a person will engage in a task for the reward inherent in the task, such as interest or enjoyment or self-fulfillment, rather than because of external carrots or external sticks. So this is a very powerful tool. And much of the policing's role, we think, actually relies significantly on intrinsic motivation. So first of all, police work is fairly autonomous in nature, in that there's a lot of discretion that officers use in how they use their powers, in forming meaningful relationships with communities and partners. They need to really buy into those in order to be able to work collaboratively. And also with the focus more on now on problem solving and being very action oriented form of working. So poorly designed or technology centered solutions can negatively impact this important intrinsic motivation. And this might include things, as Caroline said, this diminished concept of officers' roles as being like pawns rather than players, or an over focus on quantitative targets rather than qualitative outcomes. And so actually these sort of solutions can attack this idea of autonomy and therefore remove intrinsic motivation and have serious consequences on delivery of policing.
What we also found with something like predictive policing is that it doesn't recognise certain aspects of the police role, particularly the softer aspects of it. We likened it, if you like, to the role of the police guard, where you think that a police guard is someone that's involved in guarding something, and they don't actually recognise the community engagement role of the officers. And as Andrew said, that this also then conflicts with the officers' responsibility for making autonomous decisions. And what's interesting about predictive policing is the way, because it takes a technology-centered approach, is how it actually deals with issues that arise. So we notice that any design shortcomings are often framed as user acceptance issues. So instead of saying there's something wrong in terms of the design of predictive policing, it comes much more that it's said that there's something wrong with the people for not accepting that particular technology. What we also noticed was that when it comes to improvement, the focus tended to be on more data rather than on actually addressing some of these usability issues. And we like to liken this to the data minestrone approach, which is where when you want things to be better, you put more in the hope that it will improve the flavour. So fundamentally then, what we felt was that predictive policing developers failed to ask some very important questions. In what ways might we support police officers to patrol the area for which they are responsible? In what ways might we support police officers to engage effectively with citizens and partner agencies? So in terms of our next steps then, our LEA partners are currently completing the development of their tools. We've got 8 tools are being developed, 2 in each of the CCI focus areas. The tools are being demonstrated in their current working context, and they're going to be revealed from April 2021 onwards. I can say it's not a car that has been produced, but I do hope that you will be there to listen to our LEA partners talking about the various tools that they've produced in the webinars that DPT are organising. And we would very much like to see you in person. Our final conference is in November 2021, and we remain hopeful that that might be face to face. So thank you very much. I think actually we're very good to time. And if anyone's got any questions, then we're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Andrew, for that engaging presentation. We've got some interesting questions from our attendees, so I'd like to jump right in if that's okay. The first one is about the usability of the solutions. So obviously you say that you like to focus on that, but how do you consider the diversity of people? You know, we can talk about age, disability, gender. Obviously not every solution can be for everybody. So how do you account for that?
Shall I answer this, Caroline?
Yes, you go, Andrew.
So when we were doing the initial, as Caroline said, there was initial phases of the research that's done at the front end. One of them is to look at state of the art, and the other one was to scope in terms of who were the stakeholders in the particular tools that we were looking at. And so you're right that at the very beginning of the project, we had a very broad range of stakeholders for, well, especially for the community policing tool. And that was picked up through the ethnographic research that was done by Roberta, for example, who is doing the next, just to trail the next CCI webinar, who will be speaking at the next one specifically about her community policing tool. But those sort of issues were addressed as a form of, I guess, in the design lab, we had to prioritize. So one of the issues with any design project is we have to look at feasibility. And in terms of scoping what the problems were, we were looking for potential solution directions that would actually address a real issue that the potential LEA was facing. And so what we did was, where it was within the remit of that particular problem, then issues of different types of users or stakeholders was addressed. But clearly it does depend on what the solution is as to whether that's a higher or a lower priority for that particular tool. The tools that we've developed have been very much for use by frontline officers, I think I'm right in saying, Caroline. And so while they've related to obviously their work in the community, they haven't in themselves, they're not tools that would be used by citizens, for example. So where it relates to issues of usability that would relate to the prime users of those tools, then we've obviously had to consider those elements. And if that was prioritized early on, if that was highlighted, for example, at the design lab, then they would have gone out and done some research with that particular group because they would have been identified as a key stakeholder in that solution, and therefore they would have had to have been looked at. Hopefully that's clear.
Just to say that in relation to one of the tools, the law enforcement agency wanted to particularly engage with older people, for instance. So in that case, the tool is geared towards enabling that. So that's how we've done it. It's not that every tool can engage with or support everyone. It depends on the particular needs and the particular context.
Great, thank you. So in what other contexts besides policing could this human-centered design approach be used?
I mean, to be honest, it could be used in any context, but we are already using it in another context, which is to do with student safety, security and well-being. And it's worked particularly well for us in that context, I think, because there we have been working together with security managers and security officers, and they face many of the issues that police officers face when it comes to the higher education context, because actually the very human-centered aspects of their role, or the softer skills that they're required to have, are quite often not recognised in traditional approaches. What they also have is that when people think of security, including within a university context, then they quite often then think of technologies and not taking a broader perspective, which is what we've done. So hence the work that we do then is not just about security, it's about security, safety and well-being. So that's an example where we've already applied the approach.
But I think what's interesting with something like security is that it's evolving into much more of a service. People expect much more from the concept of security than they perhaps did 20 or even 10 years ago. I mean, certainly that's true in the university sector. And I think that when you start thinking of security as a service, then that becomes something where there's actually quite a lot of opportunity to improve things, to make the experience of receiving security or being supported better. And so there are areas that we'd be interested in looking at. And we've talked in the past about looking at things like airport security. Now, clearly in airports, the primary concern has been, and more recently, is around counterterrorism, but clearly that airport exists as a service environment. So how security is integrated within the experience of using an airport is really interesting, and potentially there is scope for some innovative approaches there, we would suggest, rather than it being a sort of a bolted on element of the passenger experience, if you like. And I think those sort of things where you're looking at providing a service and perhaps integrating it with other aspects, softer aspects of what security means in the 21st century, I think is quite interesting.
I think it's also particularly relevant, obviously, with COVID. Then there's a lot more issues around security, about the management of people, and how you deal with people and how you basically care for them. Means that there's a strong emphasis, I think, on adopting a human-centered approach, because we know that that is fundamental to people's well-being, and also for many organisations to providing, a good service. And it's also always been a key aspect of the work that we've done, which has been on design against crime. And we've been always looking at how can you prevent crime without increasing insecurity amongst users, without making things inconvenient, without ruining the aesthetics of something. So that's the approach that we very much come from. It's about balancing these different demands that there are, these different requirements that have to be met, and that's what makes it so interesting, such an exciting topic, I think. And I sometimes find it a shame that that approach isn't supported more within the European Security Research Programme, because it's actually, I think, by adopting that approach, that's where the real innovation would come. And although I work for the University of Salford, I actually live in Frankfurt in Germany. And I know that in Germany, in some respects, in terms of like digitalization, then we lag a bit behind. But I think as a result of that, you can see like some of the issues that there are with the technologies that we have, and how they could be fundamentally improved through a human-centered design approach. And at the moment, one of the areas that we're looking at is looking at cyber safety. And again, we'll adopt a broad approach to that. So cyber safety, security, well-being, etc. And that's a very interesting area, I think, because through some of the security measures, you can make it very difficult for a user of the various products and services. And through a human-centered approach, you can very much improve the experience for the user. But I also think that you could improve security. A lot of the security solutions that we have are fundamentally flawed because of their failure really to understand, how people operate.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question. Caroline, you've already brought up security in Europe. So how do you think either findings from CCI or this human-centered design approach could have an impact on security policy across Europe?
Well, I mean, as part of CCI, then we're going to be producing a number of policy briefings. And so we will then focus on our areas, which are, predictive policing, community policing, etc. But we will also be looking at the general approach to security, what's sometimes referred to as the European security model, and looking how that could be extended to cover what in the EU level is called petty crime. And what we've also found is that we've been very much supported by the European Commission to, for instance, to present at some of the community of user events that they've held, and been asked to produce a policy briefing. And so again, in relation to that, I think that's an opportunity for us to show how innovation can come through a human-centered design approach. And through that, I think we could actually get some real innovation, rather than, as I say, hoping that the innovation is necessarily going to come through a technology, particularly when we're dealing with the public sector, and particularly with police forces, where the need for a human-centered approach is even greater, I think.
So are you seeing this shift in the research programs as well to more human-centered design topics or human-centered topics?
I think we're seeing both, to be honest, because we are, I mean, Andrew and I obviously always have a look out for these, whether human-centered design approach is being taken up, and we have seen evidence of interest, certainly amongst some research funding bodies in the UK. But at the same time, when it comes to applied research, we often find that the fallback is then to technology. And Andrew and I were just discussing that there's some upcoming research programs around smart cities, for instance. So again, I'm sure the focus will be on technology. But what I do hope is that there is a much better understanding now of the importance of considering what is sometimes called the human factor, and of societal impact. So I do hope that there will be greater attention to some of these other aspects, together obviously with more involvement of those looking at ethical, social and legal issues.
I think it's very positive that there were some open calls in the last round of Horizon 2020, and I hope that Horizon Europe, the security program, might continue that. We have seen in the past, I mean, some years ago we looked at a Framework 7 call and just did a review of what was in it, and it was interesting, the number of actual funding schemes that were effectively defining the outcome in the call. They were actually saying, we want a camera that looks through foliage. I think was one of them that we saw that was interesting. But you have quite very tightly specified calls in some, you used to have anyway, that are, you have to question whether that's really research and not, more R&D for a company, in terms of what is the research element there that might actually create some new knowledge that might add to the field. And so I think having open calls is positive, because it enables us to look perhaps at some of the alternative views of some of these on some of these security themes.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew and Caroline. I'm going to hand back over to Margot now, because I believe we're at the end of our webinar.
Yes, thanks, Dagmar. We are very much on time. That's great. And for me, it's not much left to say, but thank you all for the webinar. Thanks to Caroline and Andrew for the interesting presentation, and thanks to Dagmar for the moderation, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And at last, I would like to take the opportunity to inform you about our further webinars. If you are interested in the topic of safety in public spaces, We have webinars on the project Stadtsicherheit 3D. It will be held in German on the 30th of March, the 13th of April, and the 27th of April. And it will be about digital planning tools for more urban safety. And of course, this webinar series on the Cutting Crime Impact project continues. The next webinar in the series will take place on the 29th of April, again at 4 p.m. And there, Dr. Roberta Signori from the Greater Manchester Police will talk about community policing. So save the date. I would be happy to welcome all of you again, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.